Of course, also this hour, House Speaker Paul Ryan will be holding his weekly news conference and will likely be fielding questions about the amended Senate health care bill, which Republicans will release today. We've got more information on that in a second, but the new bill may be already dead on arrival. Listen.
So when we looked at the bill a week ago and I said, or 2 weeks ago, and I said I couldn't support the bill as it was, they've now taken the bill and made it worse. They've taken any pretense that this is a repeal bill, and they've made it a bill that basically is a spending bill. It just came from the Republican caucus. Many other members behind closed doors are willing to admit that it's not a repeal bill.
Lanhee Chen is a Hoover Fellow and former policy director for Mitt Romney. Drew Littman is a counselor to Health and Human Services Secretary Burwell and a former chief of staff for Senators Al Franken and Barbara Boxer. Thank you very much for talking to us. Drew, before we get to health care, I just want to talk to you about something that had just pretty much crossed our wires moments ago, that there are apparently calls by the possible Senate Judiciary Committee by basically calling for Trump Jr. to ask him to testify after his release of emails. I want to ask you first, what does this tell you as this news is just now developing?
Well, I think the Trump Jr. story included two revelations very important to senators and to the special counsel. The first, which the public and reporters haven't focused on, is that the supposedly innocent part of that meeting was the part about sanctions. But there's a reason why the Russians wanted Trump to win and Hillary to lose, and getting out from under sanctions is a big part of that reason. Note also that Donald Trump had wanted to open a hotel in Moscow, but couldn't because the economy was suffering, and it was suffering in part because of sanctions. The other thing that senators are interested in is the prospect of false statements being made, possibly by Jared Kushner, possibly by others, on security clearance filings. Keep in mind, senators themselves do those kinds of filings. So do Senate staffers. They're very familiar with that process, and they're very familiar with the amount of care that has to go into doing it correctly. Okay.
Lanhee, I also just want to tell you and maybe our viewers so that they understand what he was just talking about there regarding this meeting with the Russian lawyer, because she has come out and said she doesn't work for the Russian government. She's not affiliated with the Russian government. Vladimir Putin has said he doesn't know her, had nothing to do with it. But that aside, at this point, it seems as if Aras Algorov, who was actually the father of one of their acquaintances, who was sort of behind wanting to set up this meeting in the first place. He was a Russia luxury real estate developer. He had much in common with President Trump, estimated to be worth some $1.9 billion. But he had claimed that he and Trump Sr. were going to be building a Trump Tower in Russia. He also happened to have, and the family had close ties to Putin's government. That is where this sort of comes into play when people are calling this attempted collusion, because this, of course, was somebody who was tied to the Russian government, maybe not sent by Putin himself, but nonetheless concerning. Lanhee.
Yeah, I mean, the fact pattern's not great, obviously, and I think really the issue comes back to this. It would be great if there could be a full accounting of stuff that happened during the campaign. That's part of the reason there's an investigation. It's part of the reason that all of this is going on. But at the end of the day, I think it is important for President Trump and the White House to focus on the legislative agenda, to focus on the reason why many Republicans sent the president to the White House, and that is to repeal and replace Obamacare, to deal with tax reform, with infrastructure. That's really the place where I think he's going to be able to recapture public support. And ultimately, that ought to be the focus of the administration to the extent that they can. They need to be pushing on that message. That's the important thing.
I want to talk about health care, because that is something that these lawmakers need to tackle. And Drew, this comes as the GOP is wrangling to pass a health care bill before the abbreviated August recess. And also now breaking this hour, we're hearing that Senator Lindsey Graham and Bill Cassidy have actually just unveiled details of their alternative health care plan to replace Obamacare. Let me just clue you in on a couple of the details that we're now just getting. Basically, it keeps much of the Obamacare-era taxes on the wealthy, which sends that money to the states to control instead. So the taxes would essentially apply to individuals with incomes of about $200,000 and married couples making more than $250,000. Does that appeal to Democrats, for example?
Well, sure it does, but the bigger issue for Democrats is going to be coverage. And when you're talking about, I think the bill that Leader McConnell unveiled today includes some version of the Cruz alternative, which allows insurers to sell these skimpy health insurance plans, which would cause the market to split into a market for healthy people buying cheaper insurance and unhealthy people buying insurance with much less coverage, people being unable to get pre-existing conditions covered. It's coverage first and foremost, and it's the maintenance of the Medicaid program in its current form that Democrats care about much more than they care about this tax cut issue. The tax cut issue underscores the bigger fairness questions, but it's certainly not the biggest issue in health care reform.
All right, Drew Lippman and Lanhee Chen, thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you, Joey.
Leland.
Get this. Some Twitter users are now suing the president. We're going to tell you the issue they have with his account and the role the First Amendment plays in this case. Our legal panel on